Welcome, everybody. I'm Valerie Hotchkiss. I'm the university librarian here, and I'm here to welcome you all to the first ever, as far as we know, whist evening at Vanderbilt University. We can't be too sure because Vanderbilt has a lot of connections to card games, but we're pretty sure that tonight's whist game is special. We know it is because we're here to celebrate a new and wonderful collection that has recently come to Vanderbilt. For over 100 years, the United States Playing Card Company of Cincinnati, Ohio, my fair city, owned one of the best collections of books and cards, playing cards and books about card games in the world. The core of that collection came from George Clulow, who was an English card designer and, more importantly, a card collector and a collector of books about card games. Then over the years, so they bought that in the early 20th century, and over the years, the United States Playing Card Company, and we have the second in command in our midst tonight from the United States Playing Card Company, they built it up and continued to collect in both cards and books, making it even greater. And if you are a historian of cards or card game books, you know this bibliography by Perry Hargrave. This book, this big book, is the Bible of the bibliographic Bible for people who collect cards or card game books. And it is written entirely about the collection that has just come to Vanderbilt from the United States Playing Card Company. So that's huge. This is like huge. But why Vanderbilt? Well, why not? In the first place, the history of cards is the history of culture. It's one of the most interdisciplinary fields I can think of. It has to do with everything from art to mathematics, from sociology to theology. Cards are really a cipher of civilization. So any research library should be thrilled to get a magnificent collection of books about cards and card games. But Vanderbilt is particularly happy because we have particular connections to cards. Harold Stirling Vanderbilt, who was the grandson of Cornelius Vanderbilt, our founder, is really significant in the development of, well, he was a great whist player, but he also devised the way that we do contract bridge now. So he helped develop contract bridge and the tournament system for bridge in the United States. So he's big. We've got lots of connections to cards here at Vanderbilt. I guess you could say that that collection coming to Vanderbilt from Cincinnati to Nashville, where we will take care of it forever, was fate, or you might say it was in the cards, I suppose. So I could go on and on about that collection. I mean, it is amazing. From a 15th century manuscript that includes the first ever mention of tarot cards, it's here at Vanderbilt. We've got it. To card-back designs by the great English architect and artist Owen Jones. And the deck of cards that you got on your way in reproduces one of those original designs on the back. And then you'll note when you open it up that instead of red and black, it's black and gold for Vanderbilt. You'll be able to see a few choice items from the collection out in the galleries after this talk when you go out to get some refreshments and before we start playing whist. There's an exhibit out there on distinctive collections at Vanderbilt that includes this great new card collection as well as 6 or 7 other collections that you can get a little taste of in the cases out in the foyer. So tonight we're going to hear from a scholar of whist and other games, and then we're going to play George Washington and Jane Austen's favorite game and enjoy one another's society. We're going to teach you how to play whist. Don't worry, it's not that hard. If George Washington can play it, you can play it. Probably. Before I introduce the speaker, I'm going to just run through the order of business then. We're going to listen to this great talk about Edmund Hoyle from a world expert. Then we're going to watch a 3-minute video on how to play whist. That's how hard it is, guys. Then, as our marvelous unnamed musical group from the Blair School of Music plays some music, we will repair to the foyer, get a little drink, some refreshments, or go behind this. We'll lift the screen, and there's a room back there where we have some of the books that David Levy will be speaking about tonight. So you can go back there, look at some books, get something to eat. And when you hear an 18th century bell ting-a-linging, come back to your whist table and join some friends, 3 other friends, for a couple of hands of whist. I think you'll enjoy it. All right, now our speaker. Our speaker today is David Levy from California. He's a top-level tournament backgammon player and a bridge player. He's also the world's greatest authority on the game, the ancient French game of trictrac, which is a game that's played on a backgammon board. Mr. Levy is a noted game historian, having come to this vocation after a long career in IT for the financial services industry. Mr. Levy is also a major collector of literature concerning card and board games, with a private collection that almost rivals Vanderbilt's. His current focus is on Edmund Hoyle, the first Englishman to write scientifically about strategy for popular games like whist, backgammon, chess, and brag. Mr. Levy is the official and the most authoritative bibliographer of Hoyle and has his own extensive collection of Hoyle's work, as I mentioned, but he's here looking at our Hoyles this week, and he's already made several nice discoveries, some of which he may tell you about tonight. His particular interest is in what we might now call intellectual property, I suppose. So he writes about Hoyle's ideas and then how his ideas were disseminated and transmitted and stolen. This evening he's going to offer a brief introduction to his work on Hoyle, talking to us about the rarefied world of book publishing and book piracy. So please welcome David Levy with me.
Well, thank you, Valerie, for that warm introduction. It's a pleasure to have a chance to address the Friends of the Vanderbilt's libraries, and I welcome the friends, the students, guests, everyone for welcoming me here this evening. It's also a thrill to be able to visit the collection of George Clulow and the United States Playing Card Company. Probably the best way to share the excitement is to talk about some email exchanges I had with other collectors and researchers. And their responses went something like this. You're seeing the Clulow books, the books from the United States Playing Card Company. And after the all caps and the emojis and the exclamation points, they all said, and while you're there, could you please take a look at a book or two for me? So the collection's pretty amazing, and I'm just thrilled to spend a week here looking at 100+ editions of Hoyle, and a good handful or two of books for friends. The title of my talk, You've Got Pirates, calls to mind the 1998 romantic comedy, You've Got Mail. Tom Hanks, owner of the mega chain Fox Books, put Meg Ryan's indie children's bookstore, The Shop Around the Corner, out of business when she couldn't compete. Of course, it wouldn't be a rom-com without the two falling in love. Today's story is more of a tragedy, although as you will see, there is one touch of romance. We'll be looking at competition in the book trade some 250 years earlier, in London rather than the Upper West Side of Manhattan. And we will focus on the most important book ever written about a card game, Edmund Hoyle's A Short Treatise on the Game of Whist. The competition is between the copyright owner, Francis Cogan, and two printers who pirated his work. I'm a collector, a researcher, and, if I may confess, a very, very slow writer. As to the collecting, some 25 years ago, a London dealer wrote offering me 6 different 18th century editions of Hoyle. When I purchased all 6, he wrote back, "You don't intend to collect all the Hoyles, do you?" Regardless of my intention at the time, you can see the outcome. This arts and crafts bookcase contains nearly 200 18th and early 19th century editions of Hoyle that are the highlight of my collection. This talk is going to focus on a handful of the earliest Hoyles to tell the story of how Francis Cogan responded to the piracies. I cannot tell the story merely by showing title pages. We will look at newspaper advertisements, business records, court pleadings, and more, all of which I hope will make the story come alive. My wife Marilyn tells me that boring stories about books can be made much more interesting when you tell stories about the people behind them. Unfortunately, I can't satisfy her with what we know about Hoyle. He is truly a man confined to be known from his writing. We do know that he lived from 1672 until 1769. From his books, we learn that he tutored whist to London society for the high price of 1 guinea per lesson. He sold an instructional manuscript to his students, also for 1 guinea. He later expanded that manuscript into the short treatise, which he published himself in November 1742. Thus, his first book appeared when he was 70, something that gives me hope as I struggle to complete my work. 2 other names you need to know are bookseller's Francis Cogan and Thomas Osborne Jr. Cogan, the tragic hero of our tale, purchased the whist copyright from Hoyle in February 1743. Just 2 weeks after acquiring the copyright, and before Cogan could bring out a second edition, 2 printers pirated the work. In financial difficulties over the next years, Cogan sold the Hoyle copyright to Thomas Osborne in 1745. Cogan ended up twice a bankrupt. Osborne went on to publish Hoyle with much success for decades. We'll be looking at a number of editions of the Whist Treatise, Hoyle's self-published first edition, 2 piracies, and 2 books published by Cogan, both called second editions. Evidence suggests that Cogan separately published a chapter from Whist as a broadside called The Laws of Whist, later reprinted by Thomas Osborne. So keep these in mind. The first edition, 2 piracies, 2 second editions, and the broadside, The Laws of Whist. Before we look at Hoyle's whist, let us understand what it is not. Hoyle's treatise on whist did not include rules for whist. That's kind of surprising, and it's probably the most important thing that you should take away tonight. So let me repeat it. Hoyle did not codify rules for whist. If you did not already know how to play, Hoyle's book was unintelligible. Why is that? Hoyle displaced an earlier book, The Complete Gamester, which appeared in more than a dozen editions from 1674 until the 1750s. Nearly all of them are now found here at Vanderbilt, and the earliest edition will be on display after the talk. The Complete Gamester has this to say about whist. Rough and honors, alias slam, and whist are games so commonly known in England and in all parts thereof that every child, almost 8 years old, hath a competent knowledge in that recreation. So one learned whist from a friend or family member at the table, and not from a book. Indeed, the first appearance of rules for whist did not appear until 1775, 6 years after Hoyle's death, in a book called Hoyle's Games Improved by James Beaufort. Also, it will be on display after the game. How many of you are bridge players? So we have a lot, so whist is going to make a lot of sense to you guys. I'm going to quickly go through the rules of whist, then you're going to see the video, but I think having done both of those, you're going to understand why you learn the game at the table and not from reading a book. Beaufort's rules of whist, and I've paraphrased these to make them at least a bit more intelligible. The game is played by 4 persons who cut for partners. The 2 highest and the 2 lowest are together, and the partners sit opposite one another at the table. The person who cuts the lowest card is the dealer, and deals giving 1 card to each person until he comes to the last card, which is turned up for trump. The trump card remains on the table until each person has played 1 card, and then, as it's the dealer's property, it's taken into the dealer's hand. Beaufort's description of actually how to play is pretty terse and cryptic. I'm going to read this fast because it's terse and cryptic anyway. The person on the left-hand side of the dealer plays first, and whoever wins the trick is to play again, thus going on until all cards are played out. Well, that skips a lot. So the person to the left of the dealer leads to the first trick, and may play any card in his or her hand. Play continues clockwise until everybody's played a card. If you have a card of the suit led, you have to follow suit. Otherwise, you may play any card. If any trumps were played to the trick, either by the leader or one of the later players, the highest trump wins the trick. Otherwise, the highest card in the suit led wins. That will make more sense when you get to the table. Scoring is probably a little bit simplified, what we're going to try tonight, compared with Hoyle's day, but the game, let's ignore this slide and talk about how we're going to play tonight. It's played to 5 points, and each trick above 6, there's 13 tricks, each trick above 6 counts 1 point towards the 5. So if you take 8 tricks, that's 2 extra, you win 2 points. We'll go over this all again as we get to the table. I think you'll agree that's the best place to learn. Now back to Hoyle. Here we see the first edition of Hoyle's treatise on the game of whist. Hoyle's emphasis is in a phrase in the long title: some rules whereby a beginner may, with due attention to them, attain to the playing it well. I love the archaic syntax, attain to the playing it well, and it highlights what is important and groundbreaking about Hoyle's work. Hoyle's Whist is the first book to talk about the strategy of card play, and to me, that makes it the most important book on card play ever written. The book is printed by John Watts for the author, meaning that Hoyle was the publisher. He financed the paper, printing, binding, and he distributed the book on his own. As he did with the manuscript a year earlier, Hoyle sold the book to his whist students for the high price of 1 guinea, 21 shillings, easily 3 or 4 months' wages for a skilled tradesman at the time. We can confirm that price from a number of sources, but my favorite is a passage from Fielding's 1749 work, Tom Jones. I happened to come home several hours before my usual time, when I found 4 gentlemen of the cloth at whist by my fire. And my Hoyle, sir, my best Hoyle, which cost me a guinea, lying open on the table with a quantity of porter, spilt on one of the most material leaves of the whole book. In addition to confirming the price, there are a couple of important points in the passage. First, that Hoyle would have been familiar to contemporary readers of Tom Jones. Second, the accidental spill highlights the fact that these books were intended to be used and did not sit on a gentleman's bookshelf. As a result, the earliest Hoyles survive in extremely small numbers. There are only 4 recorded copies of the first edition of Whist, and as we will see, a few more copies that may best be described as mangled. To give a first look at archival sources, here is the entry of the Whist treatise in the Book of Registry at Stationers' Hall. The Stationers' Company was the medieval guild that regulated the book trade in England. Entry into the registry was required to enforce a copyright. It's really unusual to see someone outside the trade bringing a book to Stationers' Hall. More frequently, it would be a top-end London bookseller, or less frequently, a printer. From the registry, we see that the book was published on November 17, 1742, and that Hoyle left 9 copies of the work at Stationers' Hall, presumably to be distributed to the depository libraries in the UK. Of the deposited copies, only that at the Bodleian at Oxford survives. In 2.5 months, Hoyle sold out the entire first edition. Rather than print another, and perhaps having run out of society whist students willing to pay a guinea for it, Hoyle sold the copyright to Francis Cogan. The date was February 4th, 1743, and the price for the copyright was 100 guineas. We'll look at the evidence for that shortly. But to do the math, 100 guineas is 105 pounds, or 2,100 shillings. Cogan clearly intended to print a second edition and charge the same 1 guinea that Hoyle did. Was that a reasonable expectation? We will never know, because before Cogan could bring out the second edition, a piracy appeared. On February 19th, 1743, we see an advertisement from the General Evening Post. "This day is published, price 2 shillings, a tenth the price that Cogan expected to charge." The advertisement notes that this has been sold for a guinea privately, confirming the price in Tom Jones. The pirate omits Hoyle's names, saying only that the book was written by a gentleman. The imprint, Bath printed and London reprinted for W. Webster, is fictitious. The book was not first printed in Bath, and W. Webster is an invented name intended to conceal the identity of the piratical printer. I'm not going to discuss the physical book in any detail, nor how the pirates got hold of the text, but curiosities abound. It must have had an enormous print run, as it is the most common of the early Hoyles, with some 40 copies recorded, 2 of them back on display after the talk. A second piracy appeared shortly thereafter, with an even lower price. Of the 3 copies that survive, 1 is priced at a shilling, and 2 show a price of 6pence, less than 1/40th of the price of the first edition. Again, the imprint, printed for W. Webb, London 1742, is false. There is no W. Webb. W. Webb is a name often used by pirates in the 18th century, and the book would have been widely recognized by the trade as a piracy. The date is as false as the name. This book was published in February 1743, shortly after the other piracy. Let us return to Tom Jones, which demonstrates not only that Hoyle was known to contemporary readers, but that the piracy was common knowledge as well. Recall the master was outraged that his servant had spilled beer on his Hoyle. "But I said nothing until the rest of the honest company were gone, and then gave the fellow a gentle rebuke, who instead of expressing any concern made me a pert answer, that servants must have their diversions as well as other people, that he was sorry for the accident which had happened to the book, but that several of his acquaintance had bought the same for a shilling, and that I might stop as much in his wages if I pleased." It should be evident to you already that Cogan made a bad bargain, and it took a couple of weeks for Cogan to respond to the piracies. In the General Evening Post of March 5th, Cogan finally advertises a second edition. We will dissect this advertisement over the next several slides, noting Cogan's marketing strategy relating to price, product, and brand. The first thing to notice is the price of 2 shillings. Cogan meets the pirate's price of 2 shillings and now needs to sell more than 1,000 copies to recoup the 2,100 shillings he paid for the copyright. And that ignores paper, printing, advertising, and other expenses we'll talk about in a moment. You can see a copy of this book from newly acquired from the Clulow Library. The advertisement notes, "This day published with great additions," suggesting an improvement to the text to distinguish it from the piracies. The title page promises additions to the laws of the game and a new chapter explaining some of the probability calculations in more detail. I am sure that Hoyle would have insisted that he be paid for the additions. The third and final addition is the definition of 2 terms, force and seesaw, that were apparently unfamiliar to readers of the first edition. The term force is probably familiar to bridge players, and a seesaw is something that would now be called a cross-ruff. Notice that the definitions are awkwardly placed within the table of contents. In fact, all these additions are quite minor and were made in extreme haste. While the book is printed regularly in gatherings of 6 leaves, the pagination tells another story. Note pages *5 through *10 inserted between pages 10 and 11. As one might surmise, all of the editions appear before page 11. The second edition of the Webster is much scarcer than the Webster piracy, with only 8 copies surviving, 1 here at Vanderbilt. I mentioned that there was another book, also called a second edition. Here it is, and with it, Hoyle creates the most important and most familiar element of the Hoyle brand, Hoyle's autograph signature at the foot of the note to the reader. The "to the reader" repeats language from Cogan's advertisement, and the author will not undertake to explain any case, but in such copies as have been corrected, as has been set forth by himself, or that are authorized as revised and corrected under his own hand. The autograph will appear in virtually every genuine Hoyle throughout his lifetime, but here you see the earliest example. This second edition is a completely different setting of type from the last book we looked at. We will look at its remarkable story in a moment. But how did Hoyle come to autograph the books? To answer that question, we need to jump ahead a moment to 1745. Cogan, in financial difficulties only in part caused by the Hoyle debacle, was forced to raise capital, sold off many of his copyrights, including the Hoyle copyright, to Thomas Osborne. This contract, now at the Houghton Library at Harvard, is my favorite random survival in the Hoyle story. It is between Hoyle and Osborne and concerns Hoyle's autographs. In the recitation section, it notes, "And whereas the said Edmund Hoyle had reserved to himself twopence to be paid him by Francis Cogan or his assigns upon the said Hoyle's signing his proper name in each book." So Cogan paid Hoyle twopence per signature. For a typical print run of 250 copies, twopence a copy would be roughly £2. Paper and printing for a small pamphlet such as Whist would cost about £4, so this was adding 50% to Cogan's costs. Thomas Osborne struck a different deal. In consideration of Mr. Thomas Osborne's paying in hand to the said Edmund Hoyle £25, the receipt of which he doth hereby acknowledge, the said Edmund Hoyle doth covenant and agree to sign each book as aforesaid during his life, without any fee or reward. So there you have the origin and the financial terms of the Hoyle autograph. Another aspect of the Hoyle brand is the constant specter of piracy and prosecution. Cogan advertised this book having been entered at Stationers' Hall according to Act of Parliament. Whoever shall presume to print or vend a pirate edition shall be prosecuted according to law. And Cogan did prosecute the pirates. Another archival survival is this complaint with tiny handwriting on a large piece of parchment dated April 15, 1743. Cogan seeks an injunction against 2 printers and 7 booksellers for printing and selling the Hoyle treatise in violation of his copyright. What is remarkable to me is that Cogan waited more than 2 months to seek the injunction, from early February when the piracies first appeared until mid-April. Why the delay? Any answer is speculative, but I find it striking that Cogan got married on the day before the complaint was filed. This is a small bit of romance in my tale. I don't want to suggest that his fiancée Elizabeth Smith was a bridezilla, but perhaps the impending marriage did distract him from his business. I've seen other contemporary copyright cases where the suit was brought just days after the piracy appeared. It is from this complaint that we learn the date and price of the copyright sale from Hoyle to Cogan, the 4th day of February 1743, and £105. The litigation was successful, or so the solicitors would have said. The pirates acquiesced in the injunction, stopped printing and selling the book, destroyed unsold copies, and agreed to pay Cogan's legal fees. But the damage had been done, the price of Hoyle was fixed in the marketplace at 2 shillings, and Cogan was stuck with a bad deal. Let's go back to the Cogan advertisement and back to the autographed version of the second edition. Cogan advertises, "The purchasers of the first edition may have the additions to complete their book on producing that bought of the author and paying 1 shilling. Cogan is trying to extract some more revenue from his bad bargain, but what would you expect that to mean? I would think you'd bring in your first edition and Cogan for 1 shilling would give you a very small pamphlet with the changes. The reality is much more complex. And beware, this is the high complexity point of my presentation. In fact, Cogan took the first editions and dismembered them. Here's the recipe he used. Those few of you who are comfortable with collation formulas can follow the middle column. Everybody else look at the page numbers on the right. The first edition consists of 8 unnumbered and 88 numbered pages. Cogan removed the first 9 leaves, or 18 pages, from the first edition, leaving pages 11 through 88. He saved one of the first 9 leaves to be used in the final book, and he printed a new duodecimo sheet, 2 6-leaf gatherings totaling 24 pages. The pages consisted of 8 unnumbered pages, pages 1 through 10, and what might sound familiar, pages star 5 through star 10. The book was reassembled, the new gatherings plus the reserved leaf, and the material left over for the first edition, the whole rebound. The effect of this remarkable bit of engineering is to create a second edition out of the first, with the new text from the second edition. From the point of view of a bibliographer, it's not really a second edition at all, but a reissue of the first. And as we saw earlier, this is the first book to be autographed by Hoyle. The reissue is of great rarity. There are copies at the Bodleian Library and the Beinecke at Yale, in addition to the copy in my collection. 2 others are being offered by book dealers in the UK, one sadly lacking the page with Hoyle's autograph. So how did customers feel about having their book dismembered? Remember, purchasers of the first edition were Hoyle Society whist students who paid a guinea per lesson and a guinea for the book, and now an extra shilling for the editions. Any bibliographical manual will tell you to examine as many copies as possible of each book. I've seen 3 of the 4 surviving first editions, and here's what you can learn by seeing multiple copies. The copies at the Bodleian and the University of Aberdeen have been rebound sometime in the 19th century. At left, you can see my copy. When I visited the Morgan Library in New York, I was astonished and delighted to learn that their copy is identically bound to mine. The same leather, the same end papers, and tool for tool, the same gold decorations. Now mine is a bit shabby, while the copy at the Morgan is pristine. As a collector, one cannot always keep up with J.P. Morgan. What are the implications of these 2 identical bindings? First, both must be original to the book. Second, the binding must have been selected by the publisher, and as we know, that publisher was Hoyle. This was the binding he selected for his society whist students, really a deluxe presentation binding. At right, you can see the Beinecke copy of the reissue. The spine is not contemporary, but the Dutch paper over boards is original, and this is how Cogan bound and sold his Hoyles. So how would you feel if you had brought your presentation Morocco binding to Cogan, paid a shilling, and gotten a cheap binding of paper over boards in return? I would have been extremely upset. Let us return one last time to the February 19th Cogan advertisement and look at the final component of his marketing strategy, another product expansion. At the particular desire of several persons of quality, the laws of the game are printed on fine imperial paper, proper to be framed or made screens of, that the players may have them to refer to if any differences should arise. Price 2 shillings 6 pence. The laws of whist are a chapter in Hoyle's book in which Hoyle lays down what to do if irregularities occur at the whist table. Things like a player having too many or too few cards, playing out of turn, and so on. Notice that Cogan's selling the sheet for 2 shillings 6, more than he charges for the entire book. Where did Cogan get the idea? This is speculation on my part, but perhaps he was familiar with a 1618 work by Saul called The Famous Game of Chess Play. That book contains a folded sheet with the laws of chess. A single copy with the sheet intact survives at the Huntington Library, pictured here. The sheet contains an odd note at the bottom. You may paste this brief on the back side of your chessboard. I struggle with that instruction. Two players in a dispute over the rules are going to lift up the board, scattering the pieces to the floor to consult the rules. I think Cogan had a much better premise when he suggested that the laws be framed. Unfortunately, no copies of Cogan's Laws of Whist survive. This raises the question whether they were published at all, or whether, as happens frequently, the advertising was a way to test the market. More on this shortly. Cogan went on to publish other titles by Hoyle, another book on whist, treatises on backgammon, piquet, and quadrille, yet his business continued to struggle, and he sold copyrights in 1745 and was declared bankrupt the next year. As I noted earlier, Thomas Osborne acquired the Hoyle copyright in 1745, and with more time we could dissect this ad just as we did the last and see that Osborne continued many of the same marketing strategies that Cogan introduced. Another price reduction, expansions to the text, the promise of Hoyle's autograph, and a threat to any would-be pirates. Instead, let us focus only on the Laws of Whist. Osborne reprinted all of Hoyle's works, including the laws, which he sold for the reduced price of 1 shilling apiece. He sold all of Hoyle's treatises, including the laws, bound in a single volume for 5 shillings. It is in one of these Osborne collections that I first got a sense of what the Laws of Whist must have looked like. Here is my copy of one of the Osborne collections. I photographed it in raking light so that you can see the indentation left by a folded sheet, a sheet that must have been the Laws of Whist. Someone had removed and perhaps framed the copy that started in this book, and that made me eager to find a real copy. My opportunity came one evening when I had difficulty sleeping. At about 3:30 in the morning, I began reading a novel on my smartphone. As I was flipping through the virtual pages, the phone notified me of an email. A British bookseller had just listed a book on ABE Books that matched one of my registered wants. It was an example of the Osborne collection of Hoyle, just like mine, with one additional note. Contemporary sheet, sides and joints somewhat worn, with a large folding table, the laws of the game of whist, torn but intact. A good copy. I jumped out of bed, ordered the book on my computer, and waited for confirmation. So, as not to embarrass the dealer, I won't name him or the price, which was about a quarter of what I would expect for the Osborne collection without the Laws of Whist. With the Laws of Whist, who knows what the book is worth. The book arrived in due course, and the closed tears visible here were easily repaired. And here are the laws unfolded to their full size. Other copies of the laws survive, one at the Bodleian, one at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, which unsurprisingly has a great gaming collection. Vanderbilt had a copy before the acquisition and now has 2, and you can see them both on display afterwards. As much as I wanted to frame the laws and hang them in my office, I knew that the only reason they survived for 250 plus years was that they were inside the book. Instead, I had a facsimile made, and that adorns my office. To the collector, there is a sad footnote associated with the laws. Obviously, copies that were removed from the binding are lost forever, but in fact, many, many more were destroyed. Let us jump ahead for a moment to 1767, when Thomas Osborne left the book trade. Osborne sold all of his copyrights and books at a sale open only to members of the London book trade. Here's the catalog for the sale from a facsimile at the British Library. The catalogs, annotated by attendees at the sale, are a treasure for learning about the 18th century book trade. For example, we see that Osborne owned at this time a 1/3 share in the Hoyle copyright and broke it into 4 lots of 1/12 each. Booksellers Wilkie, Woodfall, and Croder purchased the 4 lots for a total of £87, suggesting a full value of the copyright of 261 pounds. Had Cogan only been able to hold on. But there's a sadness in the sale at Well. The books did not do as well as the copyright. 4 lots of Hoyles went unsold, one of which was for 325 copies of The Laws of Whist, a sheet. The unsold copies were presumably pulped and are gone forever. Today we've looked at a number of early Hoyles and a wide variety of bibliographical evidence from newspaper advertisements, business and official records, private contracts, and quotations from Tom Jones. Recall that I questioned earlier whether Cogan's Laws of Whist were published at all. An extraordinary artifact in my collection convinces me that it was. Pictured here is an 18th century ladies' fan. It is printed and hand-painted on parchment with carved ivory sticks and guards, showing 2 couples playing at whist. The fan is quite difficult to photograph well. At the top is the name of the fan maker and a date, M. Gamble, May 3rd, 1743, much like the imprint in a book. Mary Gamble was one of the most famous and skilled fan makers in London. On the bottom left is a detail of the whist table, but it is the image on the bottom right that provides bibliographical evidence. A gentleman consults the framed Laws of Whist hung near the whist table. In May 1743, Hoyle was the only person writing about whist, and this must have been his laws as published by Cogan. Cogan had published the laws, and they're pictured in this lovely fan. Now, if someone could just find a copy for me. Back to the film, You've Got Mail. Recall that Tom Hanks' mega bookstore put Meg Ryan's indie children's bookshop out of business. If we watch the film today, we can appreciate an unintended irony, that the mega bookstore would in turn fall prey to Amazon, which had gone public only a year before the film's release. The irony in You've Got Pirates is a bit different. The usual reaction to learning of Hoyle's piracy is, poor Hoyle. But really, Hoyle was a beneficiary of the piracy. He obtained a huge sum for the copyright, earned more money for additions to the books, for his signatures, for other works. Hoyle did quite well. Francis Cogan is the one harmed by the piracies. Yet his efforts to recover have left us a lasting legacy. The 2 second editions of Whist, the autograph of Hoyle in every genuine copy, and the Laws of Whist, designed for framing. So thank you very much for letting me share some of my collection and my research, and I think we'll have some time for questions, Valerie?
I think so. Let's take a few questions, and then we'll learn how to play whist.
Yeah. So you're asking the difference between rules and laws? So the rules are kind of what we saw. If you don't know how to play, deal the cards. This is the cards you're allowed to play. This is how to keep score. The laws are what happens when something unexpected happens at the whist table. The rules say if the player leads a heart and the next person has a heart, he's got to play it. What happens if he... Do we know what that is? Fire drill?
I didn't do it.
The laws say, you know, if this guy plays a spade when he should have played a heart, what do you do? If somebody discovers, I'm supposed to have 13 cards, but I only have 12, what do you do? If you drop your hand face up on the table, that gives an advantage to your partner. How do you do that? So it's a way of getting equity rather than teaching you how to play.
But still easier than the bridge.
Whist is easier than bridge by a lot.
Is there a place here group play? Like we have bridge club. Do they have here a club for whist?
So I think there are people in England today that still play whist. I don't know of anybody in America that plays whist. It died out around 1900 when the earliest forms of bridge started being introduced. And frankly, they're better games. I mean, they're direct descendants, but they're better games.
Says you.
Yeah, I mean, you don't have your group, you have a club. People come and they play, no?
Not whist, I play bridge.
Where do you play bridge? I don't see you at the bridge club.
I'm from San Francisco, so Monday night.
So you're not from Tennessee?
No, I'm not.
No, you don't talk like that.
Any other questions? Oh, yes.
As a fundraiser, I was just wondering, does the Hoyle family have descendants, or is there a foundation, or I see all these cards, that are Hoyle cards, and I wonder, like, who's the direct beneficiary of all that?
So that's a great question. So the question is, who's the beneficiary of all the products that we see that are marketed as Hoyle? Hoyle died childless. He had a sister, she died childless, and that's like all I know about him and his descendants. The copyright for these books was done in 1774. But Hoyle became a brand. Starting in 1775, you'd see Hoyle's Games Improved by Beaufort, Hoyle's Games Improved by Charles Jones, Thomas Jones, Hoyle made familiar by somebody else, Hoyle, 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 and there was no protection in England for a brand, for a trademark. So that just kind of went into the public, and anybody could call anything Hoyle, and they have.
One last question before we watch a video about how to play whist.
Okay.
All right. You said that that a copy that existed only 5 copies, one without a title page, is for sale right now in England?
There is a copy for sale, yes.
So, do you think we should buy it, guys? Okay, we got it. All
How
right.
much God knows how much.
I think we can afford it. Okay, now everybody.